In 1944, World War II entered its decisive stage. On the Western Front, the Allied invasion of Normandy broke through the German defense lines, initiating a full-scale assault on Germany. This battle not only changed the course of the war, but also altered the destinies of countless individuals. Hermann Schmidt, once a German army officer, found his fate tightly intertwined with this war. In the German military officer training system, Hermann received a rigorous militaristic education that shaped him into a soldier who dedicated himself wholly to the nation's cause. He believed that sacrificing for the fatherland was an honor and defeat was an unbearable shame. Hermann's career was filled with both honor and challenges until the Normandy invasion. That decisive landing battle, although fiercely resisted by the German forces, was unable to withstand the powerful Allied offensive. The unit Hermann was part of was routed, and in the chaos, he was captured. For Hermann, the defeat of Germany meant not just a military failure, but the collapse of all his beliefs. Hermann was sent to an American POW camp, a strange place that felt like another world. Once a German officer, he now had to silently endure humiliation behind barbed wire. The honors of his past, the bloodshed and glory of the battlefield, were now nothing but an intangible void that he could no longer grasp with his hands. For Hermann, this defeat was not just external, but a profound internal collapse. Having lost his homeland and identity, he was forced to face the painful reality that the lofty ideals he had once believed in were shattered by the flames of war and the harshness of reality. Meanwhile, during this time, significant changes took place in the US POW camp management system and the veterans' medical system. Local governments and military hospitals took on the responsibility of managing and treating the POWs, with their lives strictly organized according to numbers and regulations. All were treated as parts of a system, no longer as individual heroes or enemies. What Hermann felt in the camp was more indifference and cruelty. His number and treatment process were indistinguishable from the others, which he could not accept. In this systemized world, he felt completely abandoned, reduced to an unnamed number. Life in the POW camp was dull and oppressive. Hermann began to constantly reflect on his life. The once heroic officer, the one who had commanded countless battles and witnessed countless deaths, was now just a forgotten name. He was filled with disdain for the camp life, and every moment of waiting made his heart feel dead. He often wondered, why had he once fought? Why had all he gained been replaced by endless humiliation and loss? Just as Hermann's spirit seemed on the verge of collapse, a chance event gave him his first glimpse of a different atmosphere. Hermann's days in the POW camp became increasingly monotonous. Every day felt like a never-ending ticking of a clock, mechanical and unfeeling. Each moment seemed shackled by numbers and the regimented management system. He had once been a high-ranking officer in the German army, commanding countless battles, witnessing the bloodshed of war. Now, he was merely an anonymous prisoner, waiting for his treatment according to a system that didn't care about his past. The former glory and faith he had held were like shattered pieces of glass, scattered on the battlefield of the past, never to be reassembled. In this harsh, militarized environment, Hermann began to notice that there was no real difference between him and the other prisoners. All the POWs were treated according to a fixed schedule, their treatment determined by their number in the system. Every time he received his medication, Hermann felt like a soulless number, not a soldier who had once fought for his country. His body began to heal, but the emotional wounds deepened. To Hermann, this systematized life meant total desolation and erasure. He was no longer a person with a history, a family, and beliefs. He had become just another faceless figure in the camp. One day, as Hermann aimlessly paced the camp grounds, a convoy of vehicles entered the POW camp. The vehicles moved slowly through the barbed wire fences, and Hermann saw that the leader of the convoy was a military officer, none other than General Patton. Hermann had never seen Patton in person, only heard the name from other soldiers in the camp. On the battlefield, Patton was undoubtedly one of the most formidable commanders in the American military. Hermann had fought against his forces, but he had never seen the legendary figure face to face. Patton's arrival stirred a strong sense of dislike in Hermann. He instinctively wanted to avoid him, but Patton's convoy did not hurry to leave. Instead, it stopped, and Patton stepped out of his vehicle and walked toward the fence of the camp. Hermann's heart tightened. Was this the moment when the Americans intended to humiliate them? The defeated soldiers? He clenched his fists as if preparing for a confrontation. Patton approached and came very close, and Hermann could almost feel the pressure emanating from him. However, Patton did not show any sign of provocation. He simply stood silently beside the fence, his gaze piercing through the barbed wire, seemingly lost in thought. After a moment of silence, Patton turned to Hermann and said simply, "You fought for your country once, didn't you? I understand your experience." The words struck Hermann like a cold knife, sinking deep into his heart. He looked at Patton coldly, his mind filled with both hostility and confusion. Patton's words were foreign to him, and they hurt. He could not understand why this American general would stand outside the POW camp at that moment, offering understanding to an enemy officer like himself. Hermann's inner turmoil flared up as he muttered under his breath, "You're just here to extract more information from us, or to humiliate us even further." Yet, Patton did not respond to these words. Instead, he stood there silently, seemingly waiting for something more profound in return. A few days later, Hermann had another unexpected encounter with General Patton. This time, Hermann was waiting for his medication, and Patton happened to pass by. When Hermann saw him, the same hostility surged in his heart, but he managed to suppress it, deciding not to engage directly with Patton. Patton stopped, walked up to Hermann, and this time, instead of speaking directly, he simply said, "You know, I've lost a lot too." Hermann was taken aback. He involuntarily looked up at Patton. The general continued, "War destroys many, but it also shows people what is truly worth cherishing." Although the words were calm, they hit Hermann like a powerful force, directly striking the core of his being. He stood frozen, unable to respond for a moment. Patton gave him a brief glance before turning and walking away. This conversation did not diminish Hermann's animosity towards Patton. In fact, it left him even more confused and uncertain. Why did General Patton not demand information from him? Why did he seem so concerned with the fate of a defeated soldier? Hermann couldn't comprehend whether this concern was sincere sympathy or if there was another hidden motive. As time passed, these random encounters and conversations became more frequent. Each conversation seemed like a gentle touch on Hermann's soul, and patterns seemed to appear more and more, intentionally or not. Hermann still harbored strong resentment, but after each encounter he began to feel his inner self being slowly chipped away. His heart, once so stubborn and closed off, started to soften. He began to realize that Patton, unlike other commanders, was not solely concerned with the outcome of the war or the intelligence of the POWs. It seemed that what mattered to him was how soldiers who had fought for their respective beliefs would reclaim their dignity after the war. Hermann had once firmly believed that everything on the battlefield was for the sake of victory. The sacrifices and suffering hidden behind that victory had long been overshadowed by the glory and ideals etched in his memory. However, as time passed and his days in the POW camp grew longer, his mindset began to shift. The appearance of General Patton caused great conflict and confusion within him. Initially, he had thought that Patton merely wanted to extract intelligence from him or continue humiliating him. But as these encounters and conversations continued, he slowly began to question Patton's attitude. But even then, Hermann couldn't fully accept Patton's notion of humanity and dignity. He still considered himself to be that officer who had once fought for his country, and his identity was far more than just that of a prisoner of war. However, Hermann's transformation did not come through hollow conversations or long periods of reflection. It came in a moment where life and death were at stake. One day, an event in the POW camp utterly shocked Hermann. A German POW named Friedrich, who had once been Hermann's comrade, was severely injured and required immediate medical attention. However, the camp's medical resources were limited, and the treatment of each individual was determined solely by their number. Friedrich's injuries were critical, and without immediate treatment, he would lose his life. Yet the systematic management rules meant that Friedrich's name was at the back of the list, and the opportunity for treatment was far out of reach. Hermann watched helplessly as his former comrade suffered, waiting for the inevitable decision of fate. Friedrich knew that he was facing a life-or-death choice, yet he did not cry like a helpless failure. Instead, he quietly accepted the whims of fate. In that moment, Hermann suddenly recalled Patton's words. What we lose in war is not just our bodies, but the very core of our humanity. You had beliefs once, but war has completely distorted them. You must learn to find your dignity again." The echo of these words in his mind slowly gave him a new understanding. He realized that Friedrich's fate was not determined by the order in which he was treated, but by whether or not he still retained his human dignity. Hermann looked at his former comrade in pain, and suddenly he understood Patton's true meaning. The victory in war could not bestow eternal glory upon them. What was truly worth cherishing was how one could preserve their fundamental humanity and dignity in the face of death and hardship. Hermann could no longer stand by and watch Friedrich's fate be decided by the cold, bureaucratic system. He rushed forward, grabbing the medic's arm and forcefully demanding that they immediately treat Friedrich. The medic, shaken by Hermann's persistence, eventually relented and decided to make an exception to treat Friedrich. At that moment, Hermann not only saved his comrade's life, but his heart was also shaken profoundly. His former identity as a soldier, his past beliefs, suddenly seemed distant and blurred, while the value of humanity became glaringly clear. Once Friedrich was successfully treated, Hermann walked alone to a corner of the camp, his heart filled with a complicated mix of emotions. He thought about Patton's every word, those seemingly simple conversations now reigniting a flame within him. Hermann understood now that Patton had not sought to humiliate him, nor was he simply trying to extract information. He was reminding Hermann that true honor did not lie in victory, but in the ability to hold on to one's basic humanity in the face of despair. Hermann's inner transformation had begun to turn his world upside down. Once a soldier who had fought for glory and victory, he now began to realize that true heroism did not lie in the triumphs of the battlefield, but in the ability to retain dignity and compassion in the depths of human suffering. In that moment, Hermann finally understood the deeper meaning of General Patton's words. War took much from them, but what was truly important was how they could rebuild themselves in the ruins of war. After Friedrich's life was saved, Hermann walked to a corner of the camp, alone. His mind was filled with a mix of emotions as he reflected on Patton's words. What had once seemed like simple exchanges now carried a profound weight. Hermann understood now that Patton was not trying to humiliate him or extract intelligence. Rather, Patton was challenging him to understand that real honor wasn't found in victory, but in the ability to maintain one's humanity and dignity, even in the face of despair. Hermann's transformation was not a sudden shift. It didn't happen through words alone or lengthy periods of contemplation. It was through action, in a moment of life and death, that he began to comprehend Patton's perspective. The concept of dignity, which had been buried beneath the layers of military pride and nationalistic fervor, began to surface. Hermann, once rigid in his beliefs about honor, now found himself rethinking everything he had known. He no longer felt bound by the notion of military glory, nor did he see his identity solely defined by his past as a German officer. Instead, he began to see himself as a human being, a person who, despite the horrors of war, could still hold on to the essence of dignity. As the days passed, Hermann's inner struggle continued. Though his body was recovering, his mind remained entangled in the past. The haunting memories of battle, the broken promises, and the shattered ideals still loomed large. Yet, he began to see these memories through a different lens. His experiences on the battlefield, once sources of pride, had now turned into reflections of pain and loss. He had fought for a cause, believing it was just, but now he saw that the true cost of war was not simply the lives lost, but the human spirit that was often destroyed in its wake. Despite the darkness in his heart, Hermann began to seek connection with the other POWs. No longer was he just a number in the system. He saw them, his fellow prisoners, not as enemies, but as human beings who, like him, had once fought for something they believed in. Slowly, he began to speak to them, to share his thoughts and listen to theirs. Each conversation, each story, brought him closer to understanding that the pain they all shared was not a mark of defeat, but a bond between them as human beings. One day, as Hermann was walking through the camp, he encountered General Patton again. This time, Patton did not immediately speak to him. Instead, the general simply stood in the background, observing the prisoners. Hermann's gaze met Patton's, and for the first time, he didn't feel anger or resentment. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of acceptance. Patton had never sought to change Hermann's past. Rather, he had shown him a way forward, a way to find dignity even in the most desperate of circumstances. After a long silence, Patton approached Hermann, who was now deep in thought. "You've done well, Hermann," Patton said quietly. Hermann turned to face him, his heart stirring with a complex mix of emotions. The anger he once felt towards the general had faded, replaced by something deeper, perhaps respect or understanding. "I did what had to be done," Hermann replied softly. "I used to believe that honor and victory were the ultimate goals, but now I realize that true dignity lies in how we maintain our humanity, even after everything is lost." Patton nodded, a faint smile of approval crossing his face. "You've found your path, Hermann. Every one of us will be scarred by the ravages of war. But the hardest thing is to rediscover ourselves after the war, to reclaim the dignity that war tries to take from us." Hermann felt a sense of warmth spread through him, as if a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. He had come to terms with his past, not through denial or shame, but through the acceptance of his own humanity. The scars of war would always be there, but they no longer defined him. What mattered now was how he chose to live, how he chose to treat others, how he viewed himself in the world. As time passed, Hermann's transformation became more evident. He was no longer the same man who had entered the POW camp filled with anger and resentment. His once rigid beliefs about honor and victory had been replaced with a new understanding of life and humanity. He began to help the other prisoners, offering them solace and support. He listened to their stories, shared his own, and in doing so, helped them process the trauma they had all endured. He no longer saw the other prisoners as his enemies, but as individuals who, like him, had been shaped by the horrors of war. They were all victims of something far greater than themselves, and in their shared suffering they found a new sense of connection. Hermann's relationship with General Patton also deepened. Although their interactions remained infrequent, each conversation left a lasting impression on him. Patton had not just given him advice or guidance. He had shown him the way forward, not as a military officer or a prisoner, but as a human being. In the days that followed, Hermann began to play a more active role in the camp. He didn't just passively wait for his treatment anymore. Instead, he took the initiative to help others. He used his military experience to encourage those who had lost all hope, providing them with support and a sense of purpose. His actions had a ripple effect, inspiring others to do the same. One day, as Hermann was speaking to a group of prisoners, Patton visited the camp once again. This time, he did not give any grand speeches or make a show of his authority. He simply walked up to Hermann, who was engaged in a conversation with the others. They stood together in silence, observing the camp and its inhabitants. The environment was still harsh, and the camp was still full of suffering. But Hermann felt a sense of peace that he had never experienced before. Patton looked at him, a small smile on his face. "You're doing good work, Hermann," he said quietly. "You've come a long way." Hermann nodded, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I've learned that real honor is not in winning, but in how we face the consequences of our actions, and how we treat others when we've lost everything." Patton's smile deepened, his eyes filled with quiet approval. "You've found your dignity, Hermann. That's something no one can take from you." Hermann's heart swelled with a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace with himself. His journey, once defined by pride and loss, was now a journey of understanding and redemption. He had found a new sense of purpose, not as a soldier, but as a man. In the months that followed, Hermann's life in the POW camp continued to evolve. No longer did he passively endure the oppressive monotony of camp life. Instead, he had embraced a new sense of purpose, helping the other prisoners and guiding them through their own inner struggles. His own transformation had given him a profound sense of empathy for others who were also suffering. He became a source of strength for those around him, using his experiences and newfound understanding to lift their spirits. Hermann no longer viewed the other prisoners simply as enemies or faceless numbers. He saw them as fellow human beings who, like him, had been swept up in the maelstrom of war. Each of them had their own story, their own pain, and their own path to recovery. Hermann shared his own journey with them, helping them make sense of their suffering, just as he had begun to make sense of his own. As he continued to help others, Hermann's relationship with Patton deepened further. Their encounters, though still infrequent, were no longer marked by the tension and mistrust that had characterized their first meetings. Instead, they had become moments of quiet understanding and mutual respect. Patton no longer seemed like the enemy general to Hermann, but a man who, despite the brutality of war, still held on to a deep respect for human dignity. One morning, as Hermann was sitting alone in the camp, reflecting on his journey, Patton appeared once again. This time, the general did not speak immediately. He simply sat beside Hermann in silence, both of them looking out at the camp and its inhabitants. The harsh realities of life in the POW camp were still present, but there was a quiet peace in the air. The men in the camp were no longer just prisoners. They were individuals who had found a sense of purpose in their shared experience. Patton turned to Hermann after a long moment. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice calm, but filled with genuine admiration. Hermann looked at Patton, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and understanding. "I've learned that true dignity is not about winning battles or achieving glory. It's about how we treat others, how we help them find their own way after everything has been lost." Patton nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "You've found your path, Hermann. In a world torn apart by war, that's no small feat." Hermann's heart swelled with a deep sense of fulfillment. He had once been a man defined by his military rank and the ideals of victory. But now he was a man defined by his actions, his ability to rise above the bitterness of war and extend a hand to those in need. He no longer sought honor in the traditional sense, but in the simple acts of kindness and respect he gave to those around him. His work in the camp had begun to have a ripple effect. As more and more prisoners found comfort in his words and actions, they too began to help one another. The once oppressive atmosphere of the camp began to shift, slowly but surely. Hermann had become a beacon of hope for the men who had once felt lost and abandoned, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a sense of dignity for himself. Despite the changes in the camp, Hermann still carried the scars of his past. The memories of the battles he had fought, the comrades he had lost, and the ideals he had once held so dear were still etched deeply in his soul. But now, those memories no longer defined him. Instead of letting them haunt him, he had transformed them into lessons about humanity, about the importance of empathy, and about the strength to move forward even after everything has been taken from you. As time passed, Hermann's role in the camp continued to evolve. He began to take on more responsibility, helping not just with the emotional and psychological recovery of the prisoners, but also with the practical needs of daily life. He helped organize routines, made sure the men received the care they needed, and offered guidance whenever it was asked of him. He had become a leader, not through any formal title, but through his actions and his commitment to the well-being of others. One day, as he was walking through the camp, Patton approached him once again. This time, the general did not offer words of praise or encouragement. Instead, he simply looked at Hermann, his gaze filled with quiet understanding. "You've done well, Hermann," Patton said simply. "You've found your dignity, and in doing so, you've helped others find theirs." Hermann nodded, his eyes meeting Patton's. There was no need for further words. He had found what he had been searching for all along, not just a sense of purpose, but the understanding that true dignity came not from external validation or victory, but from the way we choose to live our lives and treat others. Hermann's transformation was not just internal. It was visible to all who encountered him. He had become a different man, one who no longer defined himself by his past mistakes or his military rank, but by his capacity for compassion, understanding, and dignity. He had found redemption, not through his past actions, but through his present choices. In the years that followed, Hermann would leave the POW camp, stepping into a world that was still scarred by the echoes of war. But as he moved forward, he carried with him the lessons he had learned during his time in captivity. He understood that true strength did not lie in victory or glory, but in the ability to preserve one's humanity even in the face of overwhelming loss. Hermann would never forget the men he had met in the camp. nor would he ever forget the lessons they had taught him. And as he moved forward into the uncertain future, he knew that the most important thing he had gained during his time in captivity was not the return of his former glory, but the restoration of his dignity as a human being. As Hermann moved on from the POW camp, the journey ahead remained uncertain, but he no longer carried the same burden of self-doubt and shame that had once weighed heavily on him. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. Through his transformation, he had come to understand that true healing did not come from erasing the past, but from confronting it, learning from it, and choosing to move forward with dignity. The world beyond the camp had changed, and so had Hermann. The man who had once believed that honor could only be earned through military victory now understood that honor came from the choices we make in the face of adversity. It was no longer about fighting for a cause, but about how we treated others, how we treated ourselves, and how we rebuilt our lives after everything had been shattered. Hermann had become a man who valued human connection above all else. His time in the POW camp had taught him that every individual, regardless of nationality or past, deserved respect and compassion. He had learned that the human spirit could endure unimaginable hardship, and that true strength was not found in domination, but in the ability to empathize with others and to offer help when it was most needed. As he walked away from the camp, Hermann knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The world was still healing from the wounds of war, and his own wounds would take time to fully heal. But he also knew that he had found something far more important than glory or revenge. He had found his own humanity. His relationship with Patton had left a lasting impact on him. It was not just the words of the general that had shaped him, but the quiet understanding that Patton had shown throughout their interactions. In Patton, Hermann had seen a man who, despite the harshness of war, still believed in the potential for redemption and humanity. Patton had not simply been a commander to him. He had been a symbol of the possibility for change, for growth, and for reclaiming one's dignity after suffering. Hermann's life after the war would not be marked by grand accomplishments or heroic deeds. Instead, it would be defined by the quiet acts of kindness he offered to others, by the way he lived his life with integrity and empathy. He would become an advocate for peace, for understanding, and for the rebuilding of broken lives. The lessons he had learned in the POW camp, under the guidance of Patton and through his own struggles, would stay with him for the rest of his days. Years later, Hermann would look back on the time he spent in the camp with a sense of bittersweet reflection. The memories of the pain, the loss, and the hopelessness were still there, but they had become part of who he was, a reminder of how far he had come, and in that reflection, he found peace. Not the peace that comes from victory, but the peace that comes from knowing you have done everything you can to make the world a better place, even in the smallest of ways. And so, Hermann Schmidt moved forward, not as the soldier he once was, but as a man who had learned the true meaning of dignity. The future was uncertain, but with each step he took, he carried with him the lessons of the past and the understanding that redemption was not found in the glory of battle, but in the quiet strength of the human spirit.